Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And it's good to see you all here today. And a welcome to anyone who is joining us for the first time or after a long absence. So, we had been talking about the Mountains and Waters Sutra, but I thought I would depart just today, depart a little bit. There's some overlap, and talk about Thanksgiving. When I first mentioned to Carol that I was going to be talking about Thanksgiving, she had one of these "oh no" responses. How can you say anything new about Thanksgiving? Well, I don't know if I can say anything new about Thanksgiving, but I would like to share some perspectives, some observations about Thanksgiving as seeds for discussion today. So the usual Thanksgiving story that we've all been just a moment. That we're all familiar with from elementary school or wherever we encountered it, is depicted in this painting from 1914 with these prayerful pilgrims, as they were called, surrounding a table with a few of the Indians, as they were called, sort of off to the side in the background, joining them, as the story goes, by invitation. So we're all familiar with that story, I'm sure. And I think most of us are aware that that story is, at best, incomplete, and at worst, almost totally fictional. There's a lot more to the story. And there's much about it that we just don't know because documentation is scant. But we know that this event had a context, which is usually not discussed, and it also had an aftermath, which is hardly ever discussed traditionally. So what was some of the context that we know about? Well, some of the context was that there had been indigenous people in this part of the world for close to 10,000 years living sustainably on that land. There's good evidence of that. And we also know that the Europeans didn't just arrive with the Mayflower. They had been present along that coast for about 100 years on various shipping expeditions, etc., and had interacted with the indigenous people in various ways, mostly problematic. And we know that when the pilgrims, and they didn't call themselves pilgrims, they were religious separatists from the Church of England, who had a different take on Christianity than the official Anglican position, and were at risk in their native country of England. But we know that when they arrived on the ship, that they didn't encounter just a wilderness, they encountered a village that had been vacated by disease. The people who had lived there had been affected by a plague that had essentially wiped out the village. So there were structures at what came to be called Plymouth, which had been the indigenous village of Patuxet. The Patuxet tribe had been there. And in the traditional story, we know about Squanto. Squanto, the Native American who was helpful to the English, especially during that first year, because conveniently he could speak English fluently, and he also knew how to survive in that part of the world. It's not usually discussed that the reason he knew English is because he, about 5 years earlier, had been kidnapped and sold to slavery in Spain. He escaped from Spain and made his way to England, where he lived. It's not clear what he was doing exactly, but he lived there for several years, and being quick of mind, he learned the language. But he wanted to come back to his village, and when he returned to his village about a year before the, I'll just call them pilgrims, arrived, it was empty because it had been decimated by the plague. Many people think it was smallpox that affected the populations at that time, the indigenous populations, because they had not been exposed to smallpox until the Europeans arrived. He encountered, and Squanto, by the way, was the nickname given to him by the English. His given name, if I'm pronouncing it anywhere near correctly, was Tisquantum. And Tisquantum encountered the pilgrims after their arrival, and proved very helpful to them in trying to survive that first year. They were totally unprepared for what they encountered, and about half of them died during that first winter. But the event that we call Thanksgiving occurred the following fall, and it was essentially a harvest festival. And all cultures for millennia have had harvest festivals. So the colonists decided to have a 3-day celebration of the harvest, which was plentiful that year. And that's what they were engaged in. Now, by this time, there are only about 50 of them left. And it's documented that about 90 indigenous people attended that celebration as well. How they got there is uncertain. One theory is that the colonists, as part of their celebration, shot guns in the air, a practice that is still with us here in St. Louis, even today, at times of celebration. And the Wampanoag people, of whom Tisquantum was a member, had a mutual defense agreement. The Wampanoag people, with their population much diminished from the plague, were vulnerable to other surrounding tribes, and made the decision to essentially collaborate with the colonists in a mutual defense pact, because the colonists had, of course, rifles, very effective weapons, and they thought that would be protective. So anyway, when they heard the gunshots, they thought maybe the colonists were at risk, and they were fighting off someone, and they went to help. It's hard to know how they arrived there, but there were about twice as many indigenous people as there were colonists at this event. And they apparently celebrated a harvest feast. How prayerful it was, we don't know. Of course, the aftermath of the interaction between the indigenous people and the colonists is well known, but often not discussed in the context of Thanksgiving. After an initial few decades of reasonably congenial relations between the people who arrived on the Mayflower and the Wampanoag people, all that deteriorated, and as there were more and more Europeans arriving, the story turned into that of appropriation of land, displacement, genocide, cultural eradication, and the dismal history of the treatment of indigenous peoples in that land. So there's much more to the story of Thanksgiving than the traditional tale. Now, where did the traditional tale come from? It probably arose mostly in the early 20th century. The Thanksgiving holiday itself really wasn't so much about the Mayflower, but it was a more of a harvest celebration of gratitude. That was the idea for it was introduced by Sarah Josephine Hale, who was a very influential writer and magazine editor around the time of the mid-19th century. And in 1863, she got the ear of Abraham Lincoln, and Thanksgiving was established as an annual holiday. It is said that Lincoln thought that this would be a way of, I guess, cheering people up and also promoting unity in a very divided country at that time. So I guess setting that aside, or at least keeping it in mind, perhaps, isn't it good today to have a day of gratitude? Isn't it good to celebrate gratitude in some way? Thanksgiving. But the traditional notion of Thanksgiving is to give thanks to someone for something. And specifically on Thanksgiving Day, the traditional Judeo-Christian notion is to give thanks to God for various good fortunes. This is not the Buddhist view of gratitude. Gratitude, from the Buddhist perspective, doesn't really have those indirect objects. Giving thanks is more of a state of mind, more of an attitude than a practice of giving thanks to someone for something. I guess I'll illustrate by reading a sutra or a sutta from the early Buddhist teachings that addresses the topic of gratitude. There are actually two very short suttas. Called the Katanyu Suttas. Katanyu meaning gratitude. Monks, I will teach you the level of a person of no integrity and the level of a person of integrity. Listen and pay close attention. I will speak. As you say, Lord, the monks responded. The Blessed One said, now what is the level of a person of no integrity? A person of no integrity is ungrateful and unthankful. This ingratitude, this lack of thankfulness, is advocated by rude people. It is entirely on the level of people of no integrity. A person of integrity is grateful and thankful. This gratitude, this thankfulness, is advocated by civil people. It is entirely on the level of people of integrity. And the second little short teaching has some graphic images I'll warn you about. I tell you, monks, there are two people who are not easy to repay. Which two? Your mother and father. Even if you were to carry your mother on one shoulder and your father on the other shoulder for 100 years, and were to look after them by anointing, massaging, bathing, and rubbing their limbs, and they were to defecate and urinate right there on your shoulders, you would not in that way pay or repay your parents. If you were to establish your mother and father in absolute sovereignty over this great earth, abounding in the seven treasures, you would not in that way pay or repay your parents. Why is that? Mother and father do much for their children. They care for them. They nourish them. They introduce them to this world. But anyone who rouses this unbelieving, his or her unbelieving mother or father, settles and establishes them in conviction. He or she who rouses his unvirtuous mother or father settles and establishes them in virtue. Rouses his stingy mother and father, settles and establishes them in generosity. Rouses his or her foolish mother and father, settles and establishes them in discernment. To this extent, one pays and repays one's mother and father. Now, one's relationship with one's relatives, certainly with one's parents, is complicated. And I think the Buddha acknowledges this by saying that sometimes parents may be deluded or unvirtuous, stingy, foolish, or worse. Nonetheless, at a very minimum, and very significantly, we owe them the gift of this human body and this human life. And that is the fundamental gratitude from the Buddhist perspective. The preciousness of this human life and the opportunity for awakening, for wisdom, and for compassion. And gratitude is not just for objects of good fortune or fortunate events. It also includes the misfortune inevitably present in this life. Because this misfortune is an opportunity for growth, for wisdom, and for compassion. Easier said than done, I know, but nonetheless true. So the fundamental object of gratitude is this precious human life. Gratitude serves as an antidote for entitlement, feelings of entitlement, for greed, for anger, and a fundamental disposition of gratitude is encouraged. That shouldn't be misinterpreted to say that we're just happy for everything as it is and don't want to change anything. There are things that need our attention, always. We're always called upon to take care of this life, this human life. Whatever is demanded in order to do that. But for that, an attitude of gratitude is encouraged, regardless of conditions deemed favorable or unfavorable. So I think this topic of gratitude is often not discussed much in the context of Buddhism, but I guess I'm grateful for it as a topic. And knowing full well that the history of the Thanksgiving event has been distorted, I'm also grateful for this reminder to cultivate, encourage, and practice gratitude. So I think I'll end there, and I would be interested in thoughts about Thanksgiving, what people make of it, maybe how they celebrate it or don't. And how others see this notion of gratitude as a part of our practice. So we will stop there.